because the thing that most people don't realize is that a person will be required to spend down all of their assets to a certain point, and then Medicaid, the government, will kick in and start paying. But if you had $100,000 sitting in your bank account that you were hoping that when you died went to your kids, it's not going to happen, because you're going to have to spend that shit down to the cost of a burial, which might be $5,000 right now, and that's it. Hello.
Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday, turkeys. Welcome back. Hello, Kayla. How are you?
I'm good, Kaylee. How are you?
I'm good. I'm trying to still figure out my microphone situation. Well, welcome back, everybody. If it's your first time joining us, you're kind of in the part 2 of a 2-part series about everyone's favorite topic, death.
Ooh, so taboo.
So controversial. So last week we interviewed Kelly Markham, and if you haven't listened, we recommend that you go back, just take a look. It kind of lays the foundation, because this week we're kind of reflecting and building on our conversation with her. So take a look there. We'll put all of her information and her website in the show notes here again, if anybody wants to follow up. But with that being said, I have an opening quote from one of the books that she recommended we read. So for anybody out there that's interested in this topic, I've been reading Being Mortal by, I think it's Atul Gawande. Sorry, buddy, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Anyway, this is a physician. He basically was practicing medicine and then sort of started reflecting on the American way of dealing with death and dying, which is to not, and kind of just his reflections. So I found a fun quote. I'm not even done with the book yet, but here we go to open. Death, of course, is not a failure. Death is normal. Death may be the enemy, but it is also the natural order of things.
I like that. Very simple, to the point.
And from a physician's perspective, I think that makes a lot of sense. And with healthcare in general, we're always trying to beat it back, but at some point everybody's going to die. So with that being said, we talked last week with Kelly about advanced directives, palliative care, hospice care, just kind of how to prepare for death and dying, how to have those discussions with family, and how to put decisions in writing with things like medical powers of attorney or living will, so that you can make sure that you have somebody to speak on your behalf if you can't speak for yourself, and to ensure that the choices that they make for you are the choices that you would want to make for yourself. That's where we kind of started. So I guess first, Kayla, do you have any like initial thoughts, or any, I guess, no. Do you have any changes? Because when we started last week, Kelly hit it that you fall into the superstitious category of people who would rather not talk about it. Do you have any like new feelings in the last couple of weeks of reflecting, or does it still feel uncomfortable?
That's a great question. It's something that I'm probably still working through. First of all, Kelly was such a saint. It was such a pleasure having her on. I loved her so much. And very informative. And so I'm excited to chat more about both of our reflections, especially with you having, all that knowledge as well. I would say, I was thinking about it, kind of goes back to our soul episode, where even though I don't love talking about it, and I always feel like I have to like say a quick prayer after I'm done talking about it, like just to balance out the, I don't know, the negative topic. But it also is, something that is inevitable. And a lot of people, whether you're spiritual or not, do believe that potentially what's beyond life is actually better and, more fulfilling than this hard life on earth. And that you may come back and it's just to learn lessons and it's not the end all be all. So that kind of gives me some peace of mind. But I think mainly what I need to wrap my head around is, if someone's suffering, whether it's a loved one, a parent, myself, like you really have to have those conversations because you don't want to keep them suffering. And that's like, okay, that's where the people who are still here healthy, I can see start to be selfish. Like I would probably be guilty of this unless I really thought about it. Um, Selfish because they're not ready to let go, even though their loved one is suffering. And that really struck a chord when she said that. I was like, so true. You don't want to just keep them here when they're not, you're not, they don't have a quality of life.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's important in what I've reflected on and what I've seen in my short career, and then talking with Kelly, is having at first, if it's too hard to talk about death and dying, what does life and living look like for somebody? So what is quality of life? Because that changes for everybody and it's different for each person. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes when we are, or when we're working with somebody that isn't comfortable talking about death, sometimes we'll ask them like, okay, well, what does quality of life mean for you? And how much discomfort or suffering are you willing to tolerate? And does that change depending on the circumstances? Because I've heard Kelly in the past say to me, well, I would tolerate more suffering if I knew I was waiting for my daughter's wedding, or if I
Mm-hmm.
knew that my child was about to, have a grandbaby. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'll put up with a little bit more if I know that there's something that I'm waiting for, or I'm trying to stick around for. Or I think probably for moms, I can imagine when their kids are little, they'll put up with a lot more suffering and maybe they'll fight more if they're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with a certain chronic illness than if their kids are grown and stable and they know that they're taken care of. So
Mm-hmm.
definitely people's tolerance and their quality of life and what they'll put up with will change as they age and as their life circumstances age. But I've always found that's kind of a good way to approach it. Like, what does quality of life mean for you? And what are you not willing to tolerate?
Yeah, I like that question. I thought it was interesting. I think she mentioned a workbook. I don't Was it her workbook where it's or I liked the fact where it's like these are the things to start talking about because even now that I'm open to this conversation, I think it's very important. My biggest question for my next step is what is the first step for us? Like, is it just starting to have conversations? And I love how she said, like, it's multiple table conversations over time. It's not just like, let's hammer this out right now. But, like, where do you start? Obviously, you have these conversations, but then technically, it's like, who do you go to get these things in writing? Like, I talked to my mom a little bit about this, but I'm curious to what you would suggest as, like, if we've discussed this as a married couple, then where do we go from there to get it in writing so that everyone has that
Mm-hmm.
knowledge?
So for it, there's going to be slight differentiations depending upon each state. But
Mm,
I can say for sure in the state of Florida, for a medical power of attorney and a living will. So that is just going to encompass medical care. Right
okay.
now, we're not talking about assets, finances, or a last will and testament of who gets what after someone passes. So just to appoint a healthcare surrogate, someone to speak on your behalf, and then a living will, which goes through some different scenarios and you designate what types of healthcare decisions you'd want them to make, essentially. That should all be able to get done in the state of Florida. You can fill it out yourself and just have two witnesses. You're not required to have a notary here. That could be different in Texas. But like our two major healthcare facilities in this area have free forms online that you can just download and fill out. And you could just take them to like your local credit union or bank and have them notarized if you didn't have someone that could witness for you. So,
Interesting. So you would literally just Google like living testament or living will documents.
like or you could Google medical power of attorney. That's the part where you're appointing the person, and
Hmm.
then living will. And for some places, they should have those together. Most
Gotcha.
healthcare organizations would. So who's the big like healthcare facility in your area? They have like 1 million like urgent care and like ER clinics.
St. David's?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I would bet that if you went on there, they would have resources for that because most people do.
Gotcha.
But Kelly does have a website and a workbook. And so her and her partner have kind of created like a workbook to walk you through. Like I haven't done it yet, but like just some different prompts. So things for you to think about to help you like build out what kinds of decisions that you would want to make. But if you can financially afford it, I guess setting that aside, that's the free way to make sure that the healthcare piece is taken care of. If people can afford it, I always tell them like it's worth it to see an attorney so that you can do the financial side of things.
Yeah.
Because that's the stuff that obviously I can't help with either when I'm working professionally, because I'm not an attorney. But attorneys could do the all-encompassing paperwork, so they can do, again, language changes depending upon state, but here they say durable power of attorney, which would encompass finances and medical. So that
Got
would
it.
say if I'm incapacitated, this person can manage my money and can have access to my bank accounts, and they can make medical decisions for me.
And they would also be able to then do the finances and divvy the other stuff up, like the true, like what you think of as a will. They would be able to do
Right.
everything.
They
I
can do a
gotcha.
last will and testament. So then they can say finances are here. And again, I don't know all the rules, but I know that there are advantages to having that stuff spelled out so that things don't have to necessarily sit in probate, and it can prevent, obviously it can prevent some drama and some arguments. But that's something I think as our age group, it's important for sure for us to have those documents, and because of freak accidents that could happen. But it's really important for us to have these conversations with our parents, because we all have aging parents and we need to know what they would want us to do on their behalf. Just like you were saying, like at what point do you not want to have to continue to suffer? Right. What does suffering mean to you? Again, what's tolerable? What are you willing to put up with? Even just what I know of your parents, I feel like their two levels of tolerance are probably pretty different.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny. It really all depends on the person, because, I've even heard my dad joke, like, if I have any mental mishap, if I start losing it, just put me on my boat and drive me out to sea. He's like, but physical, like, even though I feel like his pain tolerance is, well, he's a redhead, so, but I think that would bother him less than mental. But it's interesting because I have been having conversations with my parents, and they've been really on top of updating everything, and they just did sit down with an attorney and spelled out everything. And I do think that, I think for now, if you can't afford that full service, I think the free documents are super important. From now, what you're telling me, I didn't know that was an option, but I think it's super important to eventually get to that point, because this is a little side tangent, but even something like how to give your kids like the current home that they own. Like, my parents aren't just giving me the home that they currently own once they pass, because there's all these capital gains taxes I would have to pay, and it like really screws stuff up. So like the attorney walked them through on how to put it in certain trust and blah blah blah, and even stuff like that. If they can do that on the real estate side, I'm sure that's going to be really powerful to go through all the medical stuff and just have everything laid out by law, so you don't miss anything and you don't get in trouble. That feels like really gives me some sense of security.
Yeah. And the financial stuff is wild, and that stuff can get so interesting, and that's a whole ball of wax that again, when we're talking about like needing increased levels of care, or if somebody has to go into a nursing home, there's a whole game people can play with trust, putting stuff in a trust to protect assets that they want to pass down to kids, versus being required to spend down assets to a certain level so that you can access Medicaid. Because the thing that most people don't realize is that nursing homes cost about $10,000 to $12,000 per month, and not many Americans have the money to pay for that.
That's
So,
crazy.
so what will happen is a person will be required to spend down all of their assets to a certain point, and then Medicaid, the government, will kick in and start paying. But if you had $100,000 sitting in your bank account that you were hoping that when you died went to your kids, it's not going to happen, because you're going to have to spend that shit down to the cost of a burial, which might be $5,000 right now, and that's it. So for stuff like that, it's things that people don't think about. And I think as Americans, maybe we're getting better at recognizing that we're going to die, but it's the dying process that we aren't comfortable talking about. And there's
Yeah.
a lot of gaps, and there's a lot of privilege that comes into play with what people can financially afford. And then some of it's just luck, like,
Yeah.
which I know that I always sound callous to people. If somebody dies quickly, I'm not going to say to their loved one, like, oh, that's great. But in my head, when I'm having conversations at home, I know what it looks like to slowly just wither, and how losing your independence and losing your ability to care for yourself can be really mentally tough for a lot of people, especially people who value independence, or mentally declining. People who have Alzheimer's and their brain is gone, but their body's still functioning fairly well. And so to me, it's always looked like a blessing to get to die quickly and never have to go into any kind of a facility, not have to make those decisions, give up car keys. And there's just there's a lot to think about and a lot to talk about. And for me, death doesn't freak me out, but dying does, like the process and how I get there. That's always what I find kind of disconcerting. And, Jason and I have a lot of conversations about this, because he and I both have been in fields where that's a reality. My last job, there are certain days I'd go into work if we're going out in the field, or it's like I could die today. Like, it's a very real reality that I don't think a lot of people our age, without having a chronic or serious medical condition, think about a lot. But that always, that kind of hung in with me. And I think that's where some of my just like flippancy with talking about death came from, because it was sort of a coping mechanism. But even before that, working with hospice, I think our country is starting to do a really cool thing where they're trying to be more intuitive and supportive of birth in a more natural way. And I'm hoping that we start to get a little bit better on how we treat our exit from this earth, because we've sanitized it so much, and now we like to pretend it doesn't exist. And like the quote that I read earlier, so many of us are like, well, there's always something we can do. There's always something we can do. And a lot of physicians, I think they mean well, but they're taught to fix people. And there's very few of them when we get to a certain age that are willing and ready to say, like, when is enough? And what does dying well mean to you? And where do you want that to happen? So we kind of got off on a tangent, but definitely the paperwork, the free part of it is important to have, because if you don't, you're left with the state hierarchy by law of who makes your decisions. So you and Kenny are married, if we use you guys as an example. So obviously, if something happened to you, or even if you just like, if one of us got in a car accident, we're both married, we don't have adult children. So if one of us got in a car accident and we just were unconscious on our trip to the hospital, our spouse by law is going to be the one to make that decision for us. Now, if me and Jason are in a car and we both get into a car accident, that's where it's important to have paperwork in place, because it would designate specifically your primary decision maker and your alternate or your secondary. Because if we don't have that lined up, it's then going to kick, I think in the state of Florida, the next of kin would be your parents if you don't have adult children. So they have to try to find parents. If they can't find parents, then they look for siblings. If they don't have siblings, I forget how they go on down the line. It gets complicated in a situation like your dad, where if it was, let's just say only your mom is alive and they're having to look for next of kin, it's going to be you, your one kid, no question. Your dad has you, and then he has 2 other children. So all 3 children would have to be contacted, and all 3 of y'all would have to come to a consensus on a decision before a decision could be made. So that's where things can get tricky if they're not in writing. If you've got one person that says, well, he wouldn't want to live this way, he wouldn't want to be, incapacitated forever, and then you had somebody on the other end of the spectrum saying like he would want to be around, he'd want to keep fighting, there's something else we could do. So then you'd have these people arguing, a sibling stuck in the middle, and nothing could happen. So he would have to continue on event, or whatever state he was in, until everybody agreed. Kelly can tell you numerous examples of that happening. I've seen it happen in my personal life, not with my immediate family, but with in-laws. And it can just get really ugly, and there can just be a lot of turmoil over it. And then people feel guilty. To me, it's very different if you have someone's wishes in writing and you can say, I know that they wouldn't want to live like this. We don't want to continue with life-sustaining treatments under these circumstances, and to be able to feel at peace. Because when you have that stuff documented in a living will, you don't have to make the decision as the decision maker. You're just voicing what this person already told you. So it takes all of the stress off of your shoulders, and it makes a sad situation at least a little bit more clear.
Right. And even if you had siblings and you came to the same conclusion easily and you were on the same page, even having to feel like you guys are the ones to pick which way to go, like that's really heavy. So I agree with you. I feel like it takes a lot of pressure off a situation that's already really stressful. So yeah, that's very interesting.
And then, kind of going on the same line, like people always think it's so morbid, but I bother people all the time for us, for our parents. If our parents can financially afford it, I would say to them, like, what are your funeral burial plans? What, do you have a preference? Do you want to be cremated? Do you want to be buried? And if they can afford it, tell them, like, go talk to a funeral home and make pre-arrangements. Like, go pick it out, prepay, have that shit done, and give that information to your child so that when the person passes away, instead of being like, oh my God, what do I do? I have to call a funeral home. Where does the body go? And then the RN, not the RNs, but the hospital is like, we're only going to keep their body in our morgue for this many days. Like, the logistics of what happens when a person die have to get dealt with at some form or another. And even like 3 siblings arguing over cremation can cause a problem. And I don't think a lot of people realize how expensive it is. Like, funeral service, $5,000, give or take. With the casket, cheapest casket's probably a couple grand. And then it costs, I think they usually charge you like 3, 4, 5,000 for the actual, like, putting it in the ground, like to dig the hole and like drop the casket. So like you're looking at $10K easy for a funeral. And I don't think a lot of parents realize that they could be putting their kids in a financial bind if they don't have that stuff sorted out. And if they can't, typically if you prepay, it's cheaper. But some people have
an option.
Yeah. Some people have really, really strong feelings about burial, which is fine. Everybody has their own preferences. But I sometimes wonder, would your preferences change if you knew how expensive it was?
Can I ask what your thought is on that for you personally?
Okay. I have 2 thoughts. My initial thought is I would just want to be cremated because it's cheaper. You can do a direct cremation. You don't have to be embalmed. Bada boom, bada bing. Cheapest one here is like $1,099. I hate that I know that. It will cost more likely when I'm of hopefully a normal dying age. Because, well, okay, I want to be cremated, but then like just bury my ashes. It is very gross to me to think about being in a box in the ground with like the worms. I also sort of like the idea of a natural burial where you're not embalmed, not a fancy casket, just like there's this cool company and I wish I knew the name of them, but they do burial shrouds which is like kind of an old school way of burying somebody, but they have there's like a hard back that the person gets set on, because obviously, like, to carry them, you don't want bodies like flopping around. But there's like a hard post, and then it's like a wrap. So it's set up so that you can fully like wrap the body, kind of like a mummy, but not so small of pieces, so that they can be like enveloped and wrapped. And I think this company even made it so there were sort of like built-in handles on it once the person was wrapped, and then they have the hard backing, so they can easily be like carried and buried. But there's a bunch
So
of
you're out
rules.
in the ground, like just chilling with
Yeah.
Mother Earth. I gotcha.
Like that idea wouldn't bother me, but I don't want to be in a field of bodies. Like, I would love to do that if I could just go be buried. Like, if we had land and I could just be buried on the land naturally without being embalmed and just shoved in the ground and like plant a tree. But I don't like the idea of it being in like just a
Cemetery.
farm of gooey bodies and boxes.
Well, yeah, when you say it like that, I definitely, the embalming process sounds like something I would not want to go through. Yeah.
So gross.
So I've never heard of that second option. My thought was always like, do cremation. But then it's like, what do you do with the ashes? Do you toss them in the ocean? Do you keep them on your mantle? Do you bury them? Can you bury them? I don't know. What is that base for?
I'm so freaked out by people that put ashes
I don't
on
want.
their house.
Uh-huh.
Like, here's granddad. I do
Maybe you
whatever.
can do a little bit and put it in a necklace,
That
and then
weirds
that's
me
it.
out. I know that people are into that, and that's totally fine. I don't get to have opinions about stuff at work, so it feels good to get to have them here. I think some of that stuff is weird, but who cares? I don't know. Anybody can do what they want. Amanda Booth, with her jewelry, does a lot of like what's it called? Tribute? Is that what tribute
Tributes.
pieces?
Okay.
So Trinkets by Amanda Booth. We talked about her Jizzy jewelry in our Dirty 30 episode, but she does a lot of memorial pieces. That's what I'm thinking of. So people will send her a small amount of cremated ashes, remains.
That's what they're called,
Yeah.
cremains.
Uh-huh.
I like that.
And pets and people. And then she'll like mix that into her clay art that she does and either make like jewelry. I think I've seen her do keychains, like small little statues. I think that stuff's cool. Like,
I think that's cool, especially if you are gonna toss your ashes somewhere, or like just let it be with Earth, because then you don't have like a site to go to like you would with a cemetery or like a burial ground. So I don't mind that option but yeah. Ooh, there's so many options. I didn't. These are the
there's
things we
so
need to think
many.
about.
There's so many options. I think the burial is a big one. That's a conversation you can have for free.
Yeah.
That's a great question to ask parents and spouses and friends. Like, what would you want? How do you want to be remembered? I tell everybody, if you visit my gravesite, I will come back from the dead and haunt you. Like, I don't believe that we're like attached to our like skin suits when we're dead. So I would rather somebody like go to a place that we used to spend time, or like go somewhere that they enjoy and like have my memories and talk about me. But I don't want you to go hang out by a rock when my goo is in the ground. This is
Yeah.
controversial for some people, but I don't have any fixation about like a spot where your shit is at.
Yeah.
I've told Jason too, though, like, if you get me cremated and then just like dig a hole and plant a tree on top of me, so there's like a thing, then I like the idea of going back into the earth naturally, not trying to
Yeah.
like be preserved and put in this fancy box. And Jesus Christ, I never want to have an open casket. That is the weirdest fucking tradition to me.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I can see some people needing the finality of seeing the person dead. I understand that because our country has sanitized death so much. But I'm hoping for myself that I can die at home and that people can say their goodbyes. I don't even care if they want to like leave my body out for a little while like they used to do with the wake. There's rules obviously with like diseases now. You can't just have someone laying around willy-nilly. But for religious purposes and ceremonial purposes, like medically, they have to leave you alone, even if you die in a facility, for a certain amount of time if the family needs to do any sort of preparation. I think it's
Got
good for
it.
people to see someone dead. I mean, I know that sounds kind of weird, but to just be like, this person's gone, say your goodbyes, and
Yeah.
that's the end of the body. I understand maybe if you didn't get to do that, why people would want that to happen at an open casket situation. But you have to be embalmed to have an open casket, and absolutely under no circumstances have I any interest in that shit. Because I don't need my body when I'm gone.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. I agree. Um, wow. Well, that's all good stuff to think about. My one other big question is, say something happened where we've taken the steps to get it all in writing, like my parents, everything's done. It's all good to go. It's, I don't know. I guess, what is the first step with, like, if something happens, the doctor comes to you and they're like, well, there's no more resolutions that are going to improve the quality of life. We're either just stagnant or we're declining. What do you want to do? I guess it's, let me go to the house and get their will out of their safe and read it and then tell them. Like, what does that actually look like? Or is that a dumb question?
No, I think it's hard. It's hard because you can't, this isn't the same as the financial part where you can really dictate, like, this goes here and that goes there. Like, medical situations are so unknown and there's so many gray areas.
So not good for type A people.
No, not good at all. And it stresses people out so bad. And I get it. But let's say, okay, I'm going to use myself as an example. Let's say I'm old and I have a chronic condition. So when we have a living will, basically it's going to go through a couple different scenarios typically. And a person's going to designate, I would or I would not want life-sustaining treatments in this situation. Life-sustaining treatments, we're talking about CPR, breathing machine, kidney dialysis, feeding tube, generally speaking. Now, if you were to say, I would not want continued life-sustaining treatments, it is not going to prevent you from getting emergent care. So if we have the big bubble of advanced directives above, we have a living will, that's a guiding document, and then we have something called a do not resuscitate order. That is going to say, I don't want CPR, period. If I go into cardiac arrest, don't fucking touch me. A physician's only going to sign that if a person has a like end stage of a serious illness. So that makes sense if you're 85 and you have Alzheimer's, to have your family say, we're going to sign a do not resuscitate order because we want this person to pass away peacefully. Because the other thing that people don't think about is when we're talking about CPR, I mean, people are doing chest compressions. A young, healthy person is probably going to have some cracked ribs. You talk about doing chest compressions on a frail person, on their first compression, I mean, it's just like down the line, all their ribs are going to break. So, like, do you want that for your parent? Does your parent want them for themselves? Probably not. But people don't think about the logistics of what that means. They just are like, I need this person to stay alive. And so some of those realities are things I just think people need to like understand and know. Versus if you're 40 and you go into cardiac arrest, do CPR, do chest compressions, like take me to the hospital, put me on a breathing machine short term to make sure that like my lungs are working. But this was to answer your question. If I am hooked up on a breathing machine, let's say for 2 weeks, they're still not seeing a lot of responsiveness. If they're not sure if my brain, how much brain activity I really have, that's when they're going to come around to a decision maker and say, okay, did this person have a living will? We've got to make some decisions. Do you want to continue on a breathing machine or do you want us to withdraw? So that could be a time where that would come up. Like once we're not seeing any improvement, this is the expected future projection for this person. Will they want us to continue trying to do CPR, continue with a breathing machine? That looks different for every person. That's sometimes when some of those difficult conversations come into play. Like for me, it's not tolerable or acceptable to be on a breathing machine in bed for the rest of my life. Absolutely not.
Right.
No, thank you. I don't care how old I am. Withdraw if there's no expected improvement. Another good example, I'm trying to think of some other scenarios where this stuff plays out. It can depend on the setting. So like,
Yeah.
if you're in the hospital, it could be a situation where you're saying we're going to take out the breathing tube, the ventilator, and the person's going to pass away because they can't breathe on their own. So it could be a really final decision like that, or it could look like what I said before, somebody has Alzheimer's, and part of that disease process is that your body kind of forgets how to eat as a way to like shut itself down. Well, some families get really freaked out by that, and then they place a feeding tube. So, for me, if I'm not cognitively here, I don't want you to do anything to artificially
Yeah.
prolong my life. So if I'm in the end stage of Alzheimer's, I want someone to get me a DNR order, because if I go into cardiac arrest, motherfucker, let me go. Do not hook me up to a goddamn dialysis machine. If my kidneys are shutting down, then my body's shutting down, and that means it wants to go. And Jesus Christ, don't put me on a feeding tube, because again, I don't want my life prolonged if my brain's not here. Like, don't keep my body moving. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Totally. Yeah. No, those are good examples to think about and kind of wrap your head around. That totally makes sense.
Or like with cancer. So like if I had end stage cancer and we had decided I'm not going to seek any more curative treatment, I'm done doing chemo, I'm done with radiation, I want to pass away peacefully, I'm going to call a hospice agency, I'm going to have them focus on comfort care, I'm going to get a DNR, because if and when I go into cardiac arrest, I don't want them to try to bring me back. Bring me back for what? So I can wither away some more later? Like,
Yeah.
so that's where some of
Yep.
those conversations come into play. Now, again, if there was some major life event that I was trying to stay alive for, I might say, I want that DNR online for 6 more, or I don't want a DNR for another like 6 more months, because I want to stay around, because there's this thing I'm trying to get to. So there's so many scenarios when you're talking about healthcare that make it hard. A lot of those documents do a good job of guiding in the right direction, because what they're doing is they're trying to pinpoint what's important to you. So is it maintaining independence at all costs? Is it like absolutely not tolerable for you to have somebody wipe your butt? Like, is that just absolutely the worst thing for you? Or would you be fine with that if your brain was still functioning? Like your dad, you said with your dad, like for him, if his mental faculties are gone, like that's it. He doesn't want to have to deal with that. So it's just, there's a lot of nuance to it, but you want to find out like the core tenets of what does quality of life mean for you? What does that look like? And what is just untenable? What are you not willing to tolerate?
Super interesting.
And then ask about burial and cremation, man, because that's a big one. That's a big one.
So many things. I love this. I mean, I'm feeling like I'm more open to the conversation. I think it's really important because even though the conversations may be difficult and icky like now, it's worth not having so much stress on your loved ones later. So I do see the importance of it all. Will you remind us what Kelly's work is and her course and her book and stuff like that? Because I love to
Yeah,
check it out myself too.
I'm going to put everything in our show notes so people can click on it, because she kind of has 2 things running. She has a course that her and a partner have made that people can work through, and basically a network that you can join, and they'll do different classes, and you have free access to some things with their network, and then there's like a purchased course that you can do. And then she also herself individually is doing consulting. So if a family feels like we'd really just like to have some one-on-one conversations, we just kind of want to work some of these scenarios out loud. And again, this is only related to healthcare, not finances. But she has a consulting business where she can meet with you, I think individually and remotely, just to go through some of those scenarios and answer specific questions and just give people a little bit more one-on-one attention if they feel like that's what they need. And then a website that already exists that she always recommends is called the Conversation Project. I think it's theconversationproject.org. We'll put that link in the chart or in the chart in the show notes. But that is a great place to go for those like kitchen table conversations. That's how they set it up. So you can kind of go in and figure out where you're at and what your comfort level is, what your family's comfort level is, and ask some questions and kind of get those conversations started.
That's amazing. I think that's super important. Wow. Yeah.
Right?
It's a lot.
Look at how much you did for your birth plan and like how well you
I
thought that
know.
through. You know, like we're all going to have we had an entry and we're all going to have an exit. So we can't control everything, just like you had a wonderful birth plan and then none of it looked the way that you imagined it would initially. The same thing can happen. We can make all these preparations for how we want to leave this world, and it may not work that way, but at least talking about, do you want to die at home? What do you want to put up with? What's your quality of life? What do you want us to do with your body when you're not using it anymore? Just some of those major decisions that people have to make that you don't want to have to guess at. So if you have these conversations, and even if you put it in writing, you still want to have ongoing conversations when you can. If things change, if there's a new diagnosis, it's always good to go back and look at those things to see if things change. But it's just important to not avoid it and to make sure that we know what people want. I mean, we have aging parents, so if they're not ready to talk about it, we very well could be the ones that have to deal with making some of those decisions. So just being like, hey, what would you want in this scenario? Are you trying to avoid a nursing home at all cost? What are you afraid of? Like what are your beliefs about cremation? Just, weird stuff. And it might like push people's buttons, and you may have to start the conversation and then you may have to back out and come back to it later. And that's okay too. I mean, not everybody, like I said, is as weird as my family where it's just like on the table all the time. But we've had some weird years. I think people are maybe a little more open to some of this because of COVID, because people did die maybe unexpectedly or were faced to think about their own mortality more than they may have been. But I think at the end of the day, it makes life more meaningful. It makes me more grateful. Like my body works. I'm able to get up. I'm able to work out, even on days when I don't want to. I'm thankful that I can. And I'm not going to be here forever, and Jason's not going to be here forever. So I don't want to walk around in this perpetual state of anxiety, but I think there's something healthy to acknowledging that. It helps you prioritize and realize what's important and appreciate what you have. So it doesn't have to be morbid and awful and ugly and scary. It can also kind of make things more poignant because we're not going to be here forever. YOLO.
Mic drop. I love it.
We went a little bit longer than we meant to, people, but thank you for hanging in with us. Maybe we'll come back around and do this again. Give you some time to do some of your documents, or like to revisit with your parents, and then we can touch base and see if anything else has changed or if we have any other questions or comments. But yeah, it's been fun.
It has been fun, very enlightening. So thank you for sharing your expertise. And again, thanks to Kelly. Yeah, it's been a good conversation, and I definitely want to keep it going on my personal end. So yeah.
Good deal. We'll tune in next week with us turkeys for our holiday, Thanksgiving. We'll be doing a special gobble gobble episode for you guys. And we're very excited about that. But thanks as always for listening, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Love you. Bye.
Love you. Bye.